The moment I first saw him, a quiet light ignited in me, something I hadn't felt in years. The evening was typical. Clouds like charcoal smudges in the sky. A busy hum of chatter and clinking glasses around the cafe on the corner of my street. It was a place I visited when I wanted to escape the routines of marriage, of duty, of the silent resignation that had seeped into my life with Jake, my husband. Jake was kind, steady, and utterly predictable. But this man with the guitar in his lap, a melody spilling from his lips and fingers like magic, he was anything but. I watched him from my corner table, captivated by how his eyes closed when he hit certain notes, as if he were alone in a different world. His voice wrapped around me like a warm mist, each note pulling me deeper under his spell. There was no name for what I felt, not at first. But as I sipped my wine and watched his hands drift across the strings, I knew I was lost. It wasn't just the music. It was the energy, the life radiating from him. His name, I would later learn, was Ethan. And he was about to become a secret I would carry. A flame I would never want to extinguish. The first time we spoke, it was after his set. He spotted me as he was gathering his things, and something in his eyes softened as he approached. "You enjoyed the music?" he asked, his voice low and slightly hoarse from singing. I felt a blush creep up my cheeks as I nodded, aware of how close he was, the scent of leather and faint cologne lingering around him. "Very much," I managed, a bit breathless, feeling a rush I hadn't felt in years. We talked, and he seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, in my life, though I kept my answers vague. When he learned my name, his smile widened, and he repeated it like a quiet melody. "Sabina," he murmured, and I knew then that it would be the start of something I couldn't turn away from, no matter how much I might tell myself otherwise. Our encounters became a ritual. Every Friday night, after Jake left for his business trip, I'd slip on a dress I hadn't worn in years, spritz on a scent I'd nearly forgotten, and walk to that cafe. Ethan would be there, guitar in hand, a quiet smile reserved just for me. The thrill of our conversations, the way he looked at me, it was intoxicating. He would talk about his music, about the way he composed songs alone at night, inspired by shadows and emotions, and sometimes, he'd whisper, by beautiful strangers who sit in darkened corners. One evening, after another mesmerizing performance, he pulled me aside and asked if he could write a song for me. For me. I laughed it off at first, nervously trying to downplay the fluttering in my chest. But he was serious, looking at me in a way no one had in years, and I nodded, heart racing. He didn't ask more of me that night, didn't even try to kiss me. Instead, he handed me a small notebook and said, "Write me something about you. Something you want me to know but can't say out loud." That night, I poured my secrets into that little book. I wrote about my marriage, about the emptiness I felt, the way Jake had become more of a habit than a husband, how I sometimes felt invisible, like the vibrant woman I once was had slipped into the shadows. And I wrote about Ethan, how he made me feel seen, cherished, alive. When I handed the notebook back to him the next Friday, he read it in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up at me, and I felt the weight of his gaze settle on my skin, lingering, burning. "You deserve so much more than shadows, Sabina," he whispered, his fingers tracing mine. Our affair was a slow burn. I remember the first time his hand brushed against mine, the jolt that shot through me. We sat on a park bench that evening, hidden under the dark sky, and he leaned in, his lips grazing my cheek, then my lips. The kiss was soft, exploratory, filled with questions we didn't yet dare to ask aloud. And when he pulled away, his eyes were searching, as if wondering if I would run. But I didn't. I stayed, lost in the intensity, the pull between us that I could no longer deny. He became my secret, a separate life that existed only in those stolen hours. I'd slip out of the house, barely breathing, afraid Jake would see the flush in my cheeks or catch the scent of his cologne on my clothes. But Jake never noticed. And perhaps that hurt most of all. The months passed and our bond grew deeper, turning into something more than just passion. Ethan called me his muse, his inspiration. Every new song he wrote was about our stolen glances, our whispered confessions, the way we existed in fragments, neither fully together nor completely apart. His music became a map of our affair, and I could hear pieces of us in every note. I knew it was reckless, dangerous, yet I felt powerless to stop, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my heart. I returned to Jake each night, putting on a mask, playing the role of the loyal wife. But each time I heard Ethan's songs, I felt a pang of guilt and exhilaration all at once, a reminder of the life I was building in shadows. One evening, as we sat in Ethan's tiny apartment, wrapped in each other's arms, he looked at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Sabina," he murmured, "what if we just ran away? Left it all behind?" For a heartbeat, I let myself imagine it. A life with Ethan, free from secrets, where I could be fully his. But the vision shattered as quickly as it came. I shook my head, feeling the weight of reality press down. I had built a life with Jake, had promises to keep, a sense of duty that I couldn't just abandon. And Ethan, I realized with a pang, would always be a part of my hidden world. A love I could never bring fully into the light. We sat there in silence, both knowing that what we shared was beautiful but unsustainable. I traced patterns on his hand, feeling the ache in my chest grow. "You'll write a song for me?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He nodded, his fingers brushing away the tear that slipped down my cheek. "Always," he said softly, and I knew he meant it. Our love would live on in notes and lyrics, in stolen glances and whispered words. The affair ended not with a fight, not with bitterness, but with the quiet acceptance of what could never be. We didn't need words. The last look we shared spoke of everything we felt but could never fully have. I walked away that night, leaving a piece of my heart with him, knowing that I would return to my life, my marriage, my shadows. And yet, sometimes when I sit alone with a glass of wine, I hear his songs, those haunting melodies he wrote for me, and I remember. I remember the way he made me feel alive, cherished, seen. And in those quiet moments I am his again, if only for a heartbeat, a memory, a fleeting note in a song that only he and I would ever understand. Returning to the life I had left waiting each evening was like slipping back into a heavy coat in the middle of summer. Jake's familiar gaze would meet mine over dinner, and he'd ask about my day with a soft, absent smile, the kind of look you give a story you've heard 100 times. And each time I'd feel a strange mix of longing and guilt swell inside me. Longing because I'd tasted something real and electric with Ethan. Guilt because I knew Jake would never understand what he couldn't see. To him, I was just his Sabina, his loyal wife. Yet the traces of Ethan clung to me, small and indelible. Our affair had ended in the way one slips out of a dream, softly, almost unnoticed at first, until the ache of waking filled me with a painful clarity. I'd lay awake beside Jake, feeling the familiar chill of our distance. Our lives had become routines held together by unspoken rules, years of habits and expectations. And in that silence I'd imagine Ethan's songs, wonder if he still played them somewhere. If a part of him still thought of me as his muse. Several months went by like that, with the distance between Jake and me widening and the silence that filled our house. It was strange. I had chosen to stay with him, chosen this life of responsibility and promises kept. But the pieces of myself that I'd uncovered with Ethan refused to fit back into the mold. I tried, of course, to fill the void Ethan had left behind. I poured myself into routines, relearned my days with Jake. But the spark of those stolen nights remained, flickering deep within me, refusing to be extinguished. Then one evening as I was walking past the old cafe, I stopped, heart pounding. The faint sound of a guitar drifted out through the open windows, a melody so familiar that I felt an ache in my chest before I even realized what it was. It was one of Ethan's songs, our song. The one he had written the night we shared our most intimate confessions. I stood there spellbound, feeling as if time had rewound, transporting me back to those early thrilling days of our affair. For a moment I considered leaving, but something stronger kept me there, tethered to that spot. I waited for the song to end, my pulse racing, my heart pounding in anticipation. I knew he wouldn't be here. It had been so long since he'd last played at this cafe. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to be here tonight, as if fate had brought me back to the very beginning of our story. The song ended, and as the last notes faded, I looked up, surprised to find myself face to face with the cafe owner. She was an older woman, warm and wise, who often nodded at me when I used to sit at the corner table, a knowing look in her eyes. "He left something for you, you know," she said, her voice gentle. I blinked, surprised. "For me?" She nodded, then disappeared behind the counter, returning moments later with a small, leather-bound notebook. My heart sank as I recognized it instantly. The notebook I'd written in, pouring out my secrets, my fears, and my wildest dreams. I hadn't seen it since I'd given it to Ethan all those months ago. "He told me you might come back," she said softly, handing me the book. "Asked me to keep it here just in case." With trembling hands, I took the notebook and sat at a nearby table, opening it slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. There, in his familiar handwriting, was a series of notes, sketches, and words, thoughts he'd written down, all inspired by me. Pages upon pages of lyrics, half-finished verses, and poems. Some were rough and unfinished, others so polished they felt like the songs he used to sing to me in the dark of his apartment. But there was one entry near the back, dated the night we'd ended things, that made my breath catch. He'd written, "If you're reading this, Sabina, I hope you found what you were searching for. I hope you feel seen, cherished, alive, whether with me or without me. This song is for you, a reminder that some loves live on, even when they must end. Thank you for letting me see you." A single tear slipped down my cheek as I traced the words, feeling an ache so deep it was almost unbearable. He had let me go with grace, even though I had been the one to walk away. The song he'd written about me, our song, was his final gift, a promise that I would always have a piece of him, even if we could never be together. For weeks I carried that notebook everywhere. I'd open it late at night, reliving memories that I knew I'd never share with anyone else. The lyrics were haunting, almost painful to read, but they reminded me of a part of myself that I refused to lose. And in those quiet moments I began to understand what Ethan had given me. A vision of who I could be. Jake noticed the change, of course, but he never asked. In his own way, I think he sensed the distance, the invisible mark Ethan had left on me. He became quieter, more introspective, a man who watched his wife without fully understanding her. And while I loved him, there was no erasing the things I'd come to know, the woman I'd found myself becoming in Ethan's arms. One evening, while Jake was in the other room, I sat at my vanity, staring at my reflection. The woman I saw was different now, her eyes brighter, her gaze more certain. She was no longer defined by roles or rules, but by a life she'd carved out in stolen moments, a secret part of herself she would keep forever. And as I closed the notebook for the last time, I felt a quiet sense of closure, knowing that Ethan's love, though fleeting, had given me a gift I could carry forever. Some loves aren't meant to last, I realized. Some come only to awaken us, to show us who we might become. And though Ethan was gone, his songs continued to echo in my heart, a gentle reminder of a life lived deeply, if only for a few precious moments. And so I returned to my life with Jake, carrying a quiet flame within me, a spark that had been reignited and would never fully die. I'd look out the window sometimes, letting my mind drift to those Friday nights, the stolen glances, the whispered confessions. But I no longer felt the same longing, the same desperate ache. Instead, I felt a quiet contentment, a love that was both complete and incomplete, a love that would remain a cherished memory. I had been his muse, his secret, and he had been mine. And in that delicate balance we had created something eternal, an affair lived not in shadows, but in music, in memory, and in the words he'd left behind, whispering to me even now, a silent promise that I would never be truly alone. Life with Jake resumed, reshaped around this secret world that only I understood. Each day seemed filled with small reminders of Ethan, yet I found myself more at peace with the quiet ache of remembering than I had thought possible. There was an odd sense of balance in it, knowing that while we had lived only briefly as lovers, that chapter of my life had profoundly and permanently altered me. Weeks slipped into months, and I held on to the memory of Ethan with a kind of reverence. I could almost feel his presence in certain places, the old cafe, our park bench, the quiet streets I used to wander with him in those early evenings. But life as it does moved forward. Jake and I settled into a gentler rhythm, and I found myself appreciating his steadiness, his quiet, predictable warmth in ways I hadn't before. One winter evening, as Jake and I sat together by the fireplace, sipping warm cider, he reached for my hand and held it gently. His grip felt solid, comforting, and familiar. There was something reassuring about the life we had built together, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, as if I could fully accept the choice I had made to stay with him. Perhaps that was what Ethan had meant with his parting words, that he hoped I would find what I was searching for. And in a way I had. But just as I felt that familiar warmth settle, a ripple broke the surface of my carefully mended calm. I received a letter, its envelope weathered and marked with faint creases, the handwriting achingly familiar. It was from Ethan. My heart raced as I traced the lines of his handwriting with my finger, feeling the pulse of emotions I thought I'd let go of. Sabina, the letter began. I know it's been some time, but I couldn't leave things as they were. There's one last song I need to write, one last piece of our story that remains unfinished. The letter was brief, its message simple. Ethan was planning a final show. A single performance of all the songs he'd written since we'd last seen each other. He was calling it Songs for the Lost Muse, and he wanted me to be there. That night I sat alone by the window, the letter clutched in my hand, staring out at the dark sky, wrestling with feelings I'd buried. Ethan's invitation brought back a flood of emotions, a sudden dizzying mixture of excitement, fear, and longing. I knew that if I went, I'd be reopening a door I'd closed for good reason. And yet the idea of hearing those songs again, of seeing him, even if just from a distance, pulled at me with a force I couldn't ignore. The days leading up to the show passed in a haze, my thoughts split between my life with Jake and the memories of Ethan that had remained dormant but not forgotten. I told Jake I'd be attending an old friend's music performance, something casual, nothing he would likely enjoy. He didn't press me, giving his usual supportive nod, and I felt a pang of guilt at the ease with which I'd deceived him. On the night of the performance, I wore a black dress, simple yet elegant, reminiscent of the dresses I'd worn during those secret evenings. It felt like a ritual, like slipping into a world that had been locked away, only now briefly reopened. As I arrived at the small venue, a quiet thrill rippled through me. The atmosphere was intimate, dim lights casting warm shadows across the room, and the soft murmur of the audience reminded me of that familiar cafe where Ethan and I had first met. I took a seat near the back, a safe distance away from the stage, feeling both excitement and trepidation. And then he appeared. He stepped onto the stage with a calm, steady presence, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. His hair had grown a bit longer, and there were faint lines around his eyes, a mark of the months that had passed since I'd last seen him. But his gaze, intense and soulful, hadn't changed. As he sat down with his guitar, he scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on me for just a fleeting moment. In that brief connection, it was as if no time had passed. I felt myself drawn into the magnetic pull of his presence, the weight of our shared past settling like a comforting yet painful reminder. Then he began to play. The first notes filled the room, delicate yet charged, each one a thread woven with memories. He started with the song he'd written for me that first night, the one inspired by the notebook of my secrets. His voice carried the same warmth and passion, his gaze occasionally drifting into the crowd, as if seeking something only he and I could understand. One song blended into the next, each one recounting fragments of our story. As he played, I felt myself transported back to those hidden moments, the stolen touches and whispered words that had once been our world. Each lyric felt like a confession, a raw, vulnerable plea. It was clear he had poured himself into this performance, into capturing the love, the loss, and the quiet ache that had defined our affair. But it was his final song that cut through me. He introduced it as a piece written for a love that was both a beginning and an ending. His voice cracked as he sang, each word heavy with meaning, as if he were speaking directly to me. It was a song of release, of quiet acceptance, a farewell that carried both gratitude and sorrow. The audience erupted in applause when he finished, but I sat frozen, tears slipping down my cheeks. It was as if he had spoken the words I could never say, a final farewell that allowed us to part without bitterness, without regret. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped quietly into the night, my heart full, yet strangely at peace. I knew Ethan and I would likely never cross paths again, that this final performance was the closing chapter of our story. But in those songs he had given me something no one else could, an ending filled with grace and understanding. Returning home that night, I felt lighter, unburdened. Jake was already asleep, his steady breathing filling the quiet room. I watched him, feeling a deep, comforting sense of belonging. For the first time in a long while, I felt whole, as if the pieces of my life had finally settled into place. Ethan's love had been a gift, one that had changed me in ways I could never fully explain, even to myself. And though he was gone, his songs remained, a part of my heart I would carry quietly forever. As the months passed, I found myself slipping back into the rhythm of life with Jake, though with a newfound ease, as if a part of me had been set free. The memories of Ethan and his music stayed with me, woven into the quiet moments of my days, like the soft, haunting notes of his last song, lingering in the air long after the performance had ended. Yet, even with my heart quieted and my life seemingly restored, traces of Ethan crept into my everyday in unexpected ways. I'd hear fragments of our song on the radio, a haunting melody that would send my mind spiraling back to those late nights in his apartment, his fingers tracing patterns along my hand as he played for me. I sometimes found myself walking by the old cafe, feeling an ache for something I could never return to, even as I knew the door to that life was firmly closed. One evening while cleaning out a drawer, I found Ethan's notebook, the one filled with lyrics and sketches from our time together. I hadn't looked at it since the night of his final show, but holding it now I felt that familiar pull, the one I thought I'd moved past. The words he'd left behind, written with such care and longing, were a reminder of a woman I'd once been, a version of myself that had existed only in the glow of those stolen evenings. With a steadying breath I flipped through the pages, lingering over the passages he'd written for me, each word a tiny piece of our shared world. It was a fragile feeling, like holding a glass ornament that could shatter with a single misstep. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not out of sadness, but from the bittersweet beauty of it all. In those words I saw the courage, the desire, and the self-discovery that Ethan had awakened in me, a part of myself that I couldn't explain even to Jake. It was around this time that Jake started noticing the change in me. Perhaps it was inevitable. My marriage had become a space I felt more grateful for, yet somehow distant from, a life that had held me firmly, even as I danced on the edge of another. Jake, perceptive as always, sensed that I was different, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He started asking about my days more often, searching my gaze as if he could see the shadows of another world flickering behind my eyes. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, Jake cleared his throat, looking at me with an intensity that caught me off guard. "Sabina," he said quietly, his voice careful, "you've been different lately. Happier, I think, but also distant." I felt my pulse quicken, guilt settling over me like a shroud. He wasn't wrong. In some ways I had drifted further from him, even though I had chosen him in the end. There was a depth to our marriage that was undeniable, but also an unspoken space between us, a part of myself that he could never fully know. The words clung to my throat, the truth of my affair with Ethan tempting me to finally confess, to offer Jake an explanation for the distance he could feel but couldn't understand. Instead I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine, hoping that my touch could communicate what my words couldn't. "Jake, I've been finding pieces of myself I thought I'd lost." It wasn't a lie, though it wasn't the full truth either. But for now it was enough. He nodded, his grip firm and steady, as if telling me he would always be here, no matter what. Over time, Jake and I settled back into a comfortable rhythm. The intensity of my longing for Ethan had softened, turning into something quieter, like a beautiful painting kept in a hidden corner of my heart. There was something freeing in the acceptance, the knowledge that while Ethan would forever be a part of me, I had returned fully to my life with Jake, embracing the steadiness he offered. But life, with its twists and turns, wasn't finished with me yet. One crisp autumn morning, as I was browsing in a small bookstore downtown, I noticed a display at the front. It was a new release, an album titled Songs for a Lost Muse. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized Ethan's name across the cover. He had finally released it, our story immortalized in songs. My hand shook as I picked up the record, staring at the familiar title. The cover was simple, just a black and white photograph of a lone street lamp in the rain, eerily reminiscent of the nights we'd spent walking the streets, lost in our own world. For a long moment I stood there, torn between the desire to walk away and the irresistible urge to hold on to a piece of him once more. Before I knew it, I had bought the album and tucked it into my bag, heart pounding at the thought of listening to his songs again. That evening, while Jake was out, I slipped the record into the player, closing my eyes as the first notes filled the room. The music washed over me, each song a memory brought back to life, as if he were there in the room with me, his presence as real and haunting as ever. The songs spoke of love, of longing, of a fleeting affair that had reshaped his heart. I could hear the pain, the beauty, the acceptance, And in those notes I heard his final goodbye, a farewell wrapped in melody, a gentle release. The last song on the album was one I hadn't heard before. It started slowly, his voice soft, almost fragile, as if he were sharing a secret only meant for me. It was a song about letting go, about loving fiercely but learning when to walk away. And as the last notes faded, I felt a weight lift from my heart. He had moved on just as I had. We had both found our closure in the spaces between his songs, in the notes left unplayed. I kept that record tucked away, a secret that I would carry, not out of longing, but out of respect for the journey we'd both taken. I realized, perhaps for the first time, that I had found my way back to myself, that the love I'd shared with Ethan had given me a gift far greater than any lasting affair. It had helped me uncover parts of myself I'd forgotten, bringing them into the light. From then on, life with Jake was different. I felt a deeper sense of peace, of commitment, knowing that I was whole, fully present in my marriage, no longer haunted by a love that could never be. I would occasionally hear one of Ethan's songs on the radio, the familiar melody wrapping around me like a gentle embrace, a reminder of the woman I'd once been, and the woman I had become. And each time I'd smile softly, grateful for the story we'd written together, a story that lived on in notes and whispers, in the quiet spaces of memory, a story that was both a beginning and an end, a chapter closed yet never forgotten. As the years stretched onward, the echoes of my brief, stolen romance with Ethan softened further, blending into the fabric of my life with Jake. They became a part of my internal landscape, a quiet place I would occasionally visit, but without the aching intensity it once held. It became more like a cherished memory, something that gave me a quiet sense of wonder rather than longing. Jake and I grew closer in ways that surprised me. The distance that once lingered between us had faded, and I often found myself smiling at his small, thoughtful gestures, appreciating the solid, unassuming love he offered. He was a steady river, gentle and enduring, while Ethan had been a storm, passionate, thrilling, but always destined to be fleeting. I'd come to treasure the calmness Jake brought into my life, realizing that while I'd sought excitement and intensity, what I truly needed was stability, the unwavering presence of someone who saw me as his partner, his equal. As the seasons shifted, Jake and I began to discuss dreams we'd put on hold. We'd talked for years about moving to a quieter town, somewhere coastal, away from the fast-paced world we'd lived in since our early 20s. The idea of a change thrilled me, perhaps because a new chapter felt like a chance to start fresh, unburdened by the past. Jake found a charming little house near the sea, nestled among tall grasses and wildflowers, with a small sunlit studio that he imagined I might use for painting or reading. His thoughtfulness struck me deeply. Jake had always known I needed a space for myself, for reflection, and his kindness was now a comfort I held close. We moved in the following summer, and the days in that coastal house began to flow with a gentle rhythm. I'd rise early, slipping out of bed to watch the sunrise over the waves, feeling the cool morning air brush against my skin. The sound of the waves became a familiar lullaby, something I found soothing in a way I hadn't expected. I took up painting again, dabbling with colors, textures, and the light that filtered through our large windows. Each brushstroke felt like a piece of myself settling into place, a way to capture fleeting moments, like the ones I'd once shared with Ethan, and give them a new form. One autumn afternoon, as I was sifting through some old boxes in our attic, I found a small wooden chest that I had nearly forgotten about. Inside, tucked among faded photographs and love letters Jake had written in our early years, was the notebook Ethan had given back to me after our affair ended. I opened it slowly, running my fingers over the well-worn pages. The faint scent of his cologne lingered, mixed with the smell of aged paper. For a moment, I was transported back to those nights, the thrill of something forbidden mingling with the tenderness we had shared. But as I read his words, I felt only a warm sense of gratitude. Each page reminded me not of loss, but of growth, of a journey that had led me back to myself. I realized that, through it all, Ethan had given me something that transcended the boundaries of our affair. He had helped me reconnect with parts of myself I'd once thought lost, and for that I would always be grateful. Just as I closed the notebook, Jake's voice echoed up from downstairs. "Sabina? I found something you might want to see." I placed the notebook back in the chest, my heart light as I headed down to join him. He stood at the back door, holding a small parcel wrapped in simple brown paper. It was addressed to me, though there was no return address, no sender information. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a small, delicate journal with a note that read, "For memories kept close to the heart. A." Ethan's familiar handwriting brought a smile to my lips. There were no songs, no confessions, just a blank journal. A gentle encouragement to write my own story, to keep moving forward. It was his quiet way of saying goodbye, of letting me know that while he remembered, he wanted me to keep building my life, unburdened by the weight of our past. That night, as Jake and I sat by the fire, I felt a profound sense of peace. The waves crashed in the distance, steady and unchanging, and I realized that the past, while beautiful and transformative, had truly settled. I had chosen this life, this love, this quiet joy. And though a part of me would always carry Ethan's memory, it felt as if he were now simply a character in my story, a meaningful chapter, but one I had read and closed with gratitude. Life continued to unfold in gentle, unexpected ways. Jake and I grew older together, our love deepening with each passing year. We'd take long walks along the beach, sharing quiet moments, exchanging stories that became richer with time. I found myself more content than I'd ever thought possible, finding beauty in the small, simple things, his laughter, the way he held my hand, the silent understanding that we had built a life of meaning side by side. Every now and then, I'd catch a familiar song on the radio, a melody from Ethan's album, and I'd smile softly, feeling no pang of longing, only a tender remembrance of the woman I'd once been. In those moments, I would silently thank him for the role he had played, for the love he had shared, and for the courage he had inspired in me to truly live, to embrace each moment fully. And so, as the years drifted onward, I held onto these memories lightly, like a seashell tucked away in a pocket, beautiful, cherished, but no longer defining. I had found my way back to myself, my marriage, my life, a life I had chosen with both heart and conviction. It was a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joy of knowing I had loved deeply, in every way that mattered. In the end, the affair with Ethan became not a source of pain or regret, but a quiet reminder of the complexity of love, of life, and of the choices that shape us. It was a reminder that some loves are meant to awaken us, to change us, even if they're not meant to stay. And as I sat beside Jake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a peace that was both deep and true. A peace that came from knowing that, in the end, I had found exactly what I had been searching for all along. The quiet years stretched forward, carrying me gently through the currents of my life with Jake. In the wake of our move to the seaside, we settled into a routine that felt both restorative and new. Our days grew richer with the slow, intentional simplicity we had chosen together, away from the hurried noise of the city. Jake thrived in our new home. I watched as he took to woodworking, filling his days with projects in a small shed we'd converted into his workshop. His hands became weathered and rough from his craft, but his smile was wide and youthful, his eyes gleaming with the joy of creating. Meanwhile, I grew more absorbed in my own world of painting. I had found a rhythm in it, a way of capturing my thoughts and feelings without words. Jake built me an easel by hand, sanding the wood smooth and painting it a soft sea green. He presented it to me one evening with a warm, shy smile, his eyes reflecting pride. He knew I needed that space, that way to express myself, and his gift reminded me of the love and patience he had always shown, even when my heart had wandered. Over time, our little coastal home became a haven not only for us but for the friends and family who drifted in and out of our lives. My sister, Claire, visited often, bringing her 2 young children. Their laughter filled the house, bringing a youthful light to every room. Claire often remarked on how happy I seemed, how different. She didn't know, of course, about the time I'd spent lost in someone else's world, but she noticed the peace that had settled over me in its place. I had come to understand that while my love for Ethan had been powerful, it had ultimately been a journey back to myself. And with that understanding, I felt a calmness that made me love Jake all the more deeply. But life, as it always does, had a way of testing even the strongest foundations. A few years after we'd moved, Jake was diagnosed with a mild but persistent heart condition. It wasn't life-threatening, but it required changes that reshaped our routines and priorities. We moved more slowly, cautiously, taking each day as it came. The fear of losing him, of watching his strength fade, cast a shadow over our lives. And yet, in that shadow our bond grew stronger. We became fiercely protective of each other, treasuring every moment we shared. I took up small responsibilities he could no longer handle, and he, in turn, leaned on me in a way he hadn't before. During those quiet months, I found myself revisiting memories of Ethan, not out of longing, but for the reminder of the resilience and strength he had helped me uncover. The courage to face the unknown, to embrace vulnerability, was something I'd learned in part through my time with him. And now, as I cared for Jake, I felt that courage guiding me through a different kind of love. A love grounded not in passion and thrill, but in quiet devotion. There was one evening deep in winter, when the waves crashed loudly outside and the wind howled around our little home, that stands out to me even now. Jake and I were sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets sipping tea. His face was thinner than it used to be, but his gaze was as warm as ever. We talked quietly, sharing memories from our years together, laughing at our early struggles, our dreams that had shifted over time. Then, in a moment of rare vulnerability, Jake looked at me with a solemn expression and said, "Sabina, I've never asked you, but do you ever wonder what might have been? If we had chosen different paths?" My heart skipped a beat at his words. Did he know? Had he somehow sensed the other life I had lived, the secret love I had buried years ago? The words hung between us, laden with an unspoken understanding. I felt a pang of guilt rise within me, but I took a steadying breath, knowing he deserved the truth even if not all of it. "Sometimes," I admitted softly, holding his gaze, "sometimes I think about the paths we didn't take, the people we might have been. But I chose this, Jake. I chose you. And I wouldn't trade this life for anything." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes gentle and filled with understanding. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I wouldn't either. In that simple exchange, I felt a profound release, a sense that Jake and I had reached an unspoken understanding about the lives we'd built and the secrets we'd carried. He didn't need to know the details, the names, the songs. He simply trusted in the love we shared, in the life we had chosen together. And in that moment, I felt my loyalty to him deepen in ways I couldn't have imagined. As Jake's health stabilized, our lives settled back into a gentle rhythm. We spent our days side by side, savoring the simple pleasures of the life we'd built. And with each passing day, the memories of my time with Ethan faded further, becoming less of a secret and more of a quiet reminder of who I had been, of the winding paths that had led me to this life. It was as though Ethan's memory had been absorbed into my soul, a part of the fabric of who I was, no longer something separate or hidden but a quiet strength within me. The years continued and Jake and I grew older together, our love deepening with every season. There were still moments when I'd hear a song on the radio or find a melody playing in the background at a cafe that reminded me of Ethan, of the life I'd glimpsed for a fleeting moment. But now, instead of feeling a pang of longing, I would smile softly, grateful for the beauty of that chapter, for the ways it had shaped me, but even more grateful for the life I had chosen. In the end, the affair with Ethan became less a story of loss or regret, and more a reminder of the complexity of love, of the winding paths that shape who we become. Some loves, I had come to understand, were meant to awaken us, to remind us of who we are and who we can be. And as I sat with Jake holding his hand watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt a peace that was both deep and enduring. A peace that came from knowing that I had lived fully, loved deeply, and in the end found exactly where I was meant to be. As the seasons wove together one year after another, our lives settled into a deep and gentle quiet. Jake's health had stabilized, and our days flowed in a rhythm that was both comforting and familiar. We woke early with the dawn, sometimes walking along the beach together, holding hands and feeling the sand beneath our feet. Our steps were slower than they used to be, but the pace allowed us to notice every detail, the shifting colors of the sky, the patterns in the waves, the soft cries of seagulls. The seaside home became a part of us, filled with memories etched into its walls and echoes of laughter and love that felt almost sacred. There was a serene predictability to our lives, and while a younger version of myself might have found it stifling, I had come to cherish the tranquility. The life I had glimpsed with Ethan was a flash of brilliance, a storm of emotion and intensity, but the life I shared with Jake had roots that grew deeper every year, like an old tree that weathers every storm and grows stronger with each passing season. Our family, too, was growing. Claire's children, my nieces, visited often, their youthful energy filling the house with a joyful chaos that Jake and I adored. Watching them run along the shore, gathering shells and shrieking with laughter as the waves chased them, reminded me of the beauty in every stage of life. Their innocence and exuberance were contagious, and on those bright afternoons, I felt as if I were experiencing my own second childhood, seeing the world anew through their eyes. One particular summer, Claire left the children with us for an extended stay while she and her husband took a trip abroad. The house was suddenly bustling with life in a way that it hadn't been in years. I found myself savoring every moment with my nieces, laughing as we baked cookies together, their flower-covered faces beaming with pride. Jake, too, seemed to find a new spark in caring for them. He built them a small swing in the backyard, a project that kept him busy for days. The sight of him working with his hands, patiently sanding the wood and checking each knot, filled me with a tender gratitude. Yet in those quiet evenings after the children had drifted off to sleep, I would sometimes find myself standing by the window, staring out at the sea, thinking of the twists and turns that had brought me here. There were no lingering pangs, no raw memories, just a soft, settled feeling. I felt grateful for every path I had taken, for every love that had shaped me. Ethan was still a part of my memories, but now he felt like a distant star, a light that had once guided me when I'd felt lost. One evening, as I was tucking the girls into bed, they asked me for a story from when I was younger. I hesitated, smiling as I looked at their eager faces, wondering what part of myself I wanted to share with them. And without realizing it, I began to tell them a story about a young woman who had once met a musician, a story I dressed up in fables and fantasy, turning our brief, intense romance into something softer, a tale of love and longing that faded like the last notes of a song. The girls listened with wide eyes, enchanted by the story, and I realized how much it had changed in my own mind over the years. Ethan had become a character, a figure from a different time, someone who had been a teacher of sorts, but who no longer held the power over me that he once had. As I finished the story, the girls drifted off to sleep, their breaths soft and even, and I felt a sense of closure settle over me, knowing that this chapter was truly at peace. As Jake and I grew older together, our bond deepened in ways that felt almost profound. There was a gentle intimacy in the smallest gestures, how he would place his hand on mine when we were lost in conversation, how we shared our morning coffee in silence, the kind of silence filled with understanding rather than words. We had become not just partners but two people who were woven together, sharing the same thoughts and rhythms without needing to speak them aloud. And then in the quiet of our lives, something miraculous happened. One spring day we received a call from Claire with news that would change our lives. Her oldest daughter, Eliza, who had been a teenager during those summer visits, was pregnant with her first child. Claire had suggested that she and her husband move closer to us, to let the child grow up by the sea, surrounded by family and the warmth of our small town. I can't describe the joy that filled me in that moment, the thrill of knowing our family would grow, that the home Jake and I had built would soon be filled with new life, with the laughter and tears of a child who would one day sit on our knees and listen to the stories of our lives. We prepared for their arrival with a renewed energy, fixing up rooms, painting walls, planting flowers in the garden that would bloom by the time the baby was born. The day they arrived was one I will never forget. As Eliza stepped into our home, glowing with the quiet anticipation of motherhood, I felt a surge of love for her, and for the life she carried within her. Jake, too, seemed energized in a way I hadn't seen in years. He took Eliza by the hand and led her to the swing he'd built so long ago for her and her sister, now freshly painted and polished, ready for a new generation. As the months passed, I found myself looking forward with an excitement that felt almost like a second chance at life. I would spend hours dreaming of the memories we would create, the stories we would share. Jake and I would be grandparents, roles we hadn't expected to fill but embraced with open hearts. In those quiet moments I would sit by the window looking out at the sea, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and gratitude. My life, once marked by brief flares of passion and longing, had become a steady flame, warm and enduring. I realized that every love, every choice, every path had led me here, to this place of quiet fulfillment. The love I had with Jake was one I had built with intention, a love strengthened by time, by forgiveness, by shared memories and dreams. As I rocked in my chair watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt a profound sense of contentment. I had lived fully, loved deeply, and found my way back to the person I was meant to be, surrounded by the people who mattered most. Ethan's memory, once a sharp ache, was now a soft reminder of the beauty of life's winding roads. His songs had become a part of my story, yes, but they were now just one verse in a long, beautiful symphony that continued to unfold. And as I held Eliza's child for the first time, feeling the warmth and weight of a new life in my arms, I knew that my heart was full, my story complete. I looked into the tiny face of my grandchild, a future full of promise, and whispered a silent thank you to the loves that had brought me here. The fleeting ones, the lasting ones, the ones that had come and gone but left their mark. In that moment I knew that every love had a purpose, every chapter its place, and that my journey was woven together by threads of memory, joy, and a love that had, in the end, grown deeper than I'd ever thought possible.